Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the AccuWeather Podcast. And this week, in honor of Halloween, we are looking into paranormal activity and the weather.
That was very good.
Pretty creepy.
Scary.
Wow.
A little scary.
Whoa.
So this week, guys, we are talking to J.V. Johnson. So he's the host of the radio show Beyond Reality, and his co-host you may have heard of, Jason Hawes. He's the founder of TAPS, the Atlantic Paranormal Society, and that ultimately led to the show Ghost Hunters, because they pretty much just started following him and his team around with cameras and video equipment. And you may not realize this, but there's a connection between weather and paranormal reports.
Now, I had no idea until we started doing some research for this episode.
Right.
Actually, this past summer in the UK, there was a major spike in ghost sightings and a lot of different calls to ghost hunters because of the heat wave in July and August.
Right, and it's not because they were delirious from being dehydrated or
that may have something to do with it. I'm not sure.
You never know, but in any event, there was a number of reports, and there have been paranormal investigators who say there is an uptick in activity with heat, ambient heat. And they also say that there's an uptick in activity when there is electrical, like lightning and storms.
And I'm really interested in it because I'm a big paranormal fan. I like watching paranormal TV shows. It is a small passion of mine. So, and like I said, paranormal doesn't always just mean ghosts. It can also just mean things that scientifically we can't understand. So it'll be really interesting to find out how all this comes together.
I think so too. I think that, so we'll be talking to JV, and he's obviously a believer in it because he makes this his life's work. But we're also going to do the flip side of the coin, a big flip side.
This is the part I'm looking forward to.
With our own meteorologist, Marshall Moss, because he recently went to one of those ghost hunting things in Gettysburg.
I can't wait to hear this story.
I know. Well, he's a big skeptic.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like you, Andy. I fall somewhere in between.
I always say like anything's possible. Really?
Because Galileo, until he discovered that the world was round, they said, well, we can't see that it's round. It looks flat to me. So,
Well, there's a bunch of flat earthers out there right now.
There are still people that are flat earthers. I know. There really is.
But I am a believer. I am a believer.
I want to believe it. And so I'm kind of hoping that ultimately that is the case. So that's what we're doing next. So stay with us.
From our global headquarters in State College, Transylvania, it's the AccuWeather Podcast. Here is your host, Regina Miller.
Well, we are joined on the phone now by J.V. Johnson. He has the radio program Beyond Reality, and so this is all paranormal, right, J.V.?
Paranormal from start to finish every night. That's right.
Thanks for taking some time to talk with us today. I appreciate it.
Very, very happy to be here.
Okay, well, let's get started talking about your career and your interest in the paranormal. How did all this get going?
That's one of the most common questions I'm asked, and it's also one of the most difficult to answer. We often think of the paranormal, at least in my circles, as ghosts, and clearly that's part of what we're talking about here. But my interest in the paranormal has extended well beyond just ghosts, and it really was fueled as a kid. There was a TV show called In Search Of that was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. And that show fascinated me. And it was less about ghosts and more about things like ancient aliens or the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. And that started my path down this road of curiosity. And then as I got a little bit older, I started to talk to people and hear these stories about their personal ghost experiences, particularly one that my mother had. And that just fascinated me as well. Now, sadly, I've had, doing a lot of investigations, I've had a lot of weird things happen to me, but I've never had a ghost walk up to me and for me to be able to say, there it is, I've finally seen it, and I'm 100% convinced that that's what we're talking about now. That experience hasn't happened to me yet. But, when I hear other people's experiences who've had that type of encounter, I am just intrigued, and I have been since I was a little kid. And that's, it started as a bit of a hobby, and it's turned into far more than that.
Right, and you've surrounded yourself with people that really know about this as well, because your co-host is from Ghost Hunters.
Yeah, in fact, he's not just one of the ghost hunters or just a ghost hunter. He is the guy that kind of started this whole thing. Jason Hawes is the founder of the TAPS organization, which for those of you who don't know what the Ghost Hunters TV show is, TAPS stands for the Atlantic Paranormal Society. And it was that group that was followed by a camera crew as they did their investigations that became the show Ghost Hunters. So I consider Jason to be kind of the, I'm not going to call him the grandfather of, because that might insult him, but at least the godfather of paranormal reality television. Ghost Hunters kind of started it all. There were a lot of imitators, and they're all good shows. I'm not trying to disparage any of them, but they all came after Ghost Hunters kind of blazed the trail. And Jason is my co-host, or I'm his co-host, however way you look at it, on Beyond Reality Radio. We've been doing the show together for 2 years, and we have a great time doing it. We talk about all things paranormal, not just ghosts, and every night when we end the program, we look at each other and say, wow, we learned something again tonight.
And now you mentioned, just out of curiosity, you mentioned your mother's ghost story that kind of intrigued you. What is that?
Well, there's two that my mother told me that just still kind of haunt me today. And one of them was when her grandmother passed away. She had a dream the night after she died that her grandmother, my mother was at a train station as a little girl because she was young at the time. Mm-hmm. And a train pulled into the train station, and her grandmother, my great-grandmother, got off the train, grabbed her hand and said, you need to come with me. I want you to come with me. And my mother, as a little girl, said, Grandma, I can't come with you. I'm not ready to go with you. And it was this kind of struggle she had in this dream where her grandmother was trying to get her to leave with her. And, of course, there's a lot of meaning to that particular dream. And it kind of scared my mother at the time. But in retrospect, she would talk about it a little more fondly, just thinking that her grandmother loved her and wanted her to be with her. And then, as a young adult, my mother tells me of the story that she woke up actually not one night, but several nights, and there would be a man standing at the end of her bed
Ooh.
in a bit of a white jacket, rubbing his hands.
Well, that's scary.
And yeah, it gives me chills down my spine when I talk about this one. She never felt threatened by this man. She never knew who it was, but he would appear not frequently, but enough that, it was kind of a regular occurrence for a while. She could never define who the person was. She couldn't connect it to a relative that may have passed away, but she assumes it had to be something like that. In fact, there were points where, I would sit in that room hoping I would see something like that. I don't know what I would have done if I saw it, but
right.
I was kind of hoping for the experience, and I was never able to see that. But she would tell that story over and over, and it gave me enough of a curiosity that I wanted to get some answers.
We were talking about investigations that people do that you talk to on your radio show, and I was just wondering, what kind of energy are investigators measuring to determine if a spirit is present? How does that work?
Well, this is a bit of a gray area because everybody's got different techniques. And I can tell you this, that despite the fact we use a lot of these devices on TV and we use them in our investigations, nobody's really, really sure what we're detecting and what we're not detecting. I always say that the best instruments you can use are your eyes and your ears. Taking that a step further, I extend that to audio recorders and video recorders. Those are the best, in my opinion, devices to use when you're doing any kind of a paranormal investigation, whether it's ghost or hunting for Bigfoot. It doesn't really matter. But then you get into devices that measure things like electromagnetic fields. If we've watched Ghost Hunters, we know they use EMF detectors, and they use a device called a K2 meter, which measures fluctuations in the EMF field. We don't know what those things are actually telling us, but what we can do is we can determine that there should be no spikes. There should be no changes in that energy based on where we are, as long as we've ruled out, electrical wires or other devices or cell phones or whatever it happens to be. So if we're in what we'll call a sterile electromagnetic environment and we're getting fluctuations, something's changing. So we've kind of connected that change in energy to the presence of some type of, whether it's a spirit or some type of interdimensional connection or whatever it happens to be. It's measuring something that shouldn't be there. And that's kind of what the paranormal is all about.
So if you go into a place, do they get like a baseline reading for a period or something like that, so that you know then as the investigation starts if there's some kind of weird spike or something, that you've already had a baseline of really what it's supposed to look like?
Yeah, establishing baselines is very, very important. And if you scanning a house and you enter an area and you see all of a sudden, a spike in the EMF field or something, then you've got to look for causes in that. Whether it's a light fixture above your head, a fluorescent light, or if it's a, electrical box in the wall even, and those things are harder to determine because you can't always see them. And then, there are simple things like somebody's cell phone. I mean, it's common that somebody thinks they're getting some type of paranormal reading, and it's their cell phone, either on a table next to them or in their pocket that's generating some type of electromagnetic field. So you're absolutely right. The baseline is important. You can't determine fluctuation unless you know what your starting point is.
Are there certain types of weather that would impact an investigation?
That is a great question. The answer is maybe. We do know that, we see and experience activity when there's an energy source. We know that weather provides all sorts of energy, whether it's rain providing running water, off the roof of a house, that creates an energy, or it's an electrical storm putting electrically charged particles into the air, that provides an energy. Or if it's heat, if it's a warm night, we know that heat is a form of energy, and even if it's just in the air, it's just the ambient temperature of the air, there's an energy associated with that. So what we do know for sure is anything that can provide a source of that type of energy is potentially something that could help fuel activity.
So if there's a thunderstorm or lightning discharge, or if there's like a heat wave or something, when you say it can have a spike in activity, do you mean that it's a spike in how the instruments would read the electromagnetic field, or do you think that it actually influences paranormal activity, like spirit world, kind of thing? Because people do report more, activity maybe during a heat wave, or you'll hear of people reporting higher incidents.
We do know that if we're doing an investigation and there are thunderclaps, that's going to affect our audio recordings. So these are things that we have to look at from a very practical standpoint and say, okay, we've got to be careful of that type of contamination because it could make our instruments reflect something that is not paranormal. It's just measuring a lightning strike, or it's measuring a thunderclap that reverberates through a house. And sometimes those things are distant. You don't necessarily hear them right away. And you don't even know what's happening in some cases because they're distant, and yet it makes the house rumble a little bit because our instruments can be quite sensitive. But having said that, the answer to the bigger question is, does it fuel paranormal activity itself? And we believe it does. And again, as I said before, this stuff requires energy. If a spirit is going to, let's just use a kind of a cliched example, but knock on a wall or knock on a door or something so that you can hear it, it needs a source of energy to be able to manifest that. We know that some of that energy comes in the form of heat because we can determine that, or again, it's a bit of a, it's not a proven science, but it's something that practical experience has told us is true, that a cold spot will form in an area because that spirit is drawing the energy from that heat in the ambient temperature, from the air, to use as an energy source to be able to manifest whatever phenomena that you're experiencing. So, yeah, that energy coming from these phenomena, whether, again, it's running water from a rainstorm, whether it's electrically charged particles in the air, even prior to a lightning strike, because as we know, it's those particles that are becoming charged that actually ends up creating the lightning strike.
Okay.
Or it's wind. That's wind rubbing against, a surface creates static electricity. There are all sorts of ways that weather phenomena will, in turn, create energy that will help fuel some paranormal phenomena.
Can it partially be energy fields from other things that allow activity, in your perspective, to be higher in certain locations? Because I would think there's certain locations specifically that have some other kind of energy fields, whether it be magnetic or something.
Well, we do know this. We know that there are places that are more active than other places, and sometimes we can explain why that might be. I guess to the layperson, you might think, oh, well, that just happens to be where the ghost is. Well, that's not always the case. Quote-unquote ghost might be there because the energy source is there. And there are things like geology and geography that help fuel the phenomenon. For example, any place that has like a limestone bedrock seems to have more activity. That limestone, for some reason, will help generate some type of energy that helps fuel the activity. Running water, I've mentioned it a couple times. Running water seems to be something that will help fuel activity. And I'm not exactly sure why, but we've seen it enough in practice that we can comfortably say there is a connection.
And you mentioned a sudden rush of cold. Sometimes I've seen that, as I've watched Ghost Hunters or as I've watched some of these shows where they'll say that when someone thinks a spirit is close. And you were saying that's absorbing energy.
Yeah, exactly. The quote-unquote cold spots. When you're in the middle of a room that's closed up, windows are closed, everything is pretty well sealed, and you're walking through the middle of the room and suddenly you feel a dramatic drop in temperature. That's a hard thing to explain just in the course of what's happening in the room, unless you start adding paranormal activity to it. And we never look at these things in isolation. We always couple them with something else that'll help corroborate what's happening. So, for example, we're walking through this room, we feel a cold spot, and all of a sudden we hear, some type of unexplained noise. Or we catch at the same time on one of our voice recorders an EVP, which stands for electronic voice phenomena, which is not something you hear with your ears, but you hear it in playback later when you're listening to the recording. And that is timed with that cold spot being experienced. Those things come together and you say, okay, well, what's happened here is the EVP or the knock on the wall or whatever it happened to be, or the voice you might hear, was able to manifest itself because it drew heat from the air as a source of energy to be able to do that, and that's why we felt the cold spot.
So investigators are looking for more than one confirmation of what it is they're seeing.
Good investigators are, yes.
Right. The other thing I think is interesting is because as I've watched these shows, and it's always at night. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's terrifying. Does it have to be at night? Can you do the investigation in the middle of the day? Does night dark have an impact on it?
Well, there are a couple reasons it does. Often what we're looking for is some type of light source that would indicate activity. And when you're doing these investigations in the day, you don't often see the subtle changes in light. Now, we've often caught activity because we've seen a glow or a flash of light. And in some cases, orbs, which we don't put a lot of stock in, but we have caught, quote-unquote, orbs that are emitting their own light. We never would have seen that during the day. So the dark helps us determine if a light being generated by something that shouldn't be there. So that does help. The other thing that nighttime does help is it tends to reduce external contamination, noise, people. When you're poking around a building at 2 a.m, there's less traffic outside. There's less of those things than there would be during the day. So there's some practical reasons for it too.
What's maybe one of the incidents of highest activity or one of the most compelling incidents to kind of maybe prove spirit activity in your experience?
I can actually share one that I'm going to share two.
Okay.
One is far more emotional than the other for me. The first was at Rolling Hills Asylum in East Bethany, New York, which is near Rochester, New York. And it's a place that we investigated many, many times. It was on the show a couple times on Ghost Hunters. It's been on all the other paranormal shows as well. We actually did a bunch of events there. And at one of those events, I was in one of the buildings on the 3rd floor, and I actually, and this may sound silly to some people, but to me it was very, very real. I stood at the end of a hallway with 2 other people. We all saw the same thing. We saw a green glow at the end of a hallway, which over the course of about 10 or 15 seconds started to take the form of a person. Then it started to move down the hall toward us. Now, it was faint enough that there's still a hint of doubt as to what I was seeing, but it was there, and it was real enough that everybody else with me saw it, and we didn't describe it at the same time. It was after the fact that we described it to each other, and we all saw the same thing. This thing moved down the hallway. It stopped about halfway down the hallway and dissolved. That's the closest I've personally come to a full-bodied apparition. And the other one I'll share with you is far more personal. Last year, my mother passed away, and I was at her bedside when she did. We'd been waiting a couple days because she was ill, and time finally came. I stood there with her. I watched her take her final breath. And it was about 10 or 15 seconds after that. We were in a hospital room, in fact, intensive care hospital room. Shortly after she took her final breath, 10, 15 seconds later, a gust of wind crossed my face, that came from nowhere. There was no heating vents. Nobody came in the room. Nothing. It was a gust of wind that crossed my cheek, and I'm convinced that it was my mother saying goodbye to me.
Yeah.
And of all my paranormal experiences, that one clearly has the most meaning to me.
I'm sure. And I'm sorry about your mother. I'm sorry to hear about that. But I appreciate you sharing that story with me. Very interesting. It's interesting to hear about all of this. Well, JV, tell me about the Scaricon that you have coming up so that people know what that is and where and when.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this. I promote and run this event. It's a paranormal and horror film pop culture fan convention. And the one we've got coming up is actually October 26th to the 28th at Turning Stone Casino in Verona, New York, which is near Syracuse, New York. And what we do is we bring in a bunch of celebrities, whether it's movie celebrities from horror movies or it's paranormal television, reality television, paranormal personalities. And they come and they all have a booth and they meet people and they sign autographs and they take pictures and they spend a weekend with whoever comes out to hang out with us. In addition to that, we've got a bunch of great vendors that have very, very unique products, specifically at Halloween time. And we show films. Many of them are new films, never shown before, horror generally. Panel discussions and Q&A sessions with all the celebrities. And then we have parties at night. And it really is a Friday through Sunday get-together of people who share a passion for these types of entertainment. It's a lot of fun, and it's coming up October 26th through the 28th, and the website is scaricon.com.
All right, great. Thanks for sharing the information.
And JV, of course, if people are looking for your radio show, once again, what's it called and where can they find it?
There's a couple of ways that it can be found. Our favorite way is if somebody finds a radio station carrying it. It's called Beyond Reality Radio, and we air live midnight to 2 a.m. Eastern, and we're live Monday through Friday night. Our website is beyondrealityradio.com. It lists our affiliates there. There's a couple of other ways it can be listened to as well. We have an app for both iPhones and Android phones. You can also listen live on the website.
Okay, great. Thanks for taking the time with us today, JV. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time. It was fun to talk about this.
And our thanks to JV Johnson. Make sure to check out beyondrealityradio.com and Scaricon.com with their Scaricon coming up October 26th through the 28th in Verona, New York.
So we talked to JV, and coming up next we have Marshall Moss, who...
This is going to be interesting.
This is going to be interesting because anybody that knows Marshall, he's a really opinionated guy from New York. So, okay, that paints the picture there. Opinionated big guy from New York. And he's our resident skeptic. But before we get to him, I want to talk to you about your ghost experience because Andy is like the resident nice guy. I mean, we like him.
Nice
Ghosts
guy?
are going to like him.
Ghosts like me.
Gullible guy.
He's not. I don't believe you are, Andy. I want to hear about your experience.
I mean, I didn't personally have an experience so much as my girlfriend did over the summer. We were staying in a house in Buffalo, New York, and it was built in like 1830 something, and it was kind of old, made a lot of sounds, kind of creepy. I went to bed fine that night. I was tired. I just went to sleep. But my girlfriend could not sleep that night, and she felt very unnerved just by being in this room. She felt like something was watching her throughout the whole night as I slept. But the next morning, I woke up, and she's like, I'm not going to sleep in this room again. I'm like, well, why? What's wrong? And she said, I just have a bad feeling. I have a weird feeling about this room. So I was like, okay, that's fine. We'll do what you want. So we went back downstairs, and she wouldn't go back upstairs.
Right.
And she started doing some, some of those EVP recordings as well. She would leave her phone and try to, pick up voices. Didn't hear that much, but after a day or so of being there, and every time I did kind of go back upstairs to that floor, it was a little unnerving. It was a little creepy.
Now,
See?
was the house
Gullible.
known?
Influenced.
Now, wait a second. Was the house known as being a haunted house?
Not that I know of.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I didn't do much research about the house before we went there, but,
right.
You think old house, you obviously think
Yeah.
haunted. But it was a little uncomfortable.
Now, see, I told you guys I own a funeral home. Just happen to own. It's like an investment property, but anyway, it's a funeral home. And I remember when people would come over, and we lived upstairs for a time while we were building our other house, and they would be like, "Aren't you creeped out that you live above a funeral home?" And I was like, "No, they're not. They're passing through." Ghosts here are not staying and haunting the funeral home. They're going back to wherever they lived. It was a big old house like that. But I think there are some people that are just more sensitive, and maybe have the ability to pick up on something. So I don't know. That's kind of where I stand on this. And with that, let's bring Marshall in. I wanted to bring you in, Marshall, because you actually just recently had an experience where you went to, it was like the haunted Gettysburg, right? Right. So tell me what was going on there that you went, because I've heard some people talk about this and they say it's pretty creepy, but you said you were there and they were kind of trying to provoke some ghosts. So tell me about your trip there.
Sure. So we went there for what was called the world's largest ghost hunt. I guess it was an event that was filmed around the world. There was a variety of places around the world where they were doing it and streaming it everywhere. And my wife is big into this.
Oh, okay.
So throw that out there. I went there for her. It happened to be during the Penn State-Ohio State game, so I
you
made
really
quite
went
the
there
sacrifice.
Yeah.
There was a group there there were some people from, I think it was the Ghost Hunters show, but it was one of those popular shows, and it was at these people's house where they run the tours. Apparently there were supposedly Confederate soldiers out in the field behind them. There was a couple of graves on the property.
So this is one of those places that they say has like paranormal activity
Right.
on a regular basis, so they're coming in to check it out.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And the people report it, and they lead tours all the time, and they've supposedly seen Confederate soldiers walking and things in
Okay.
their hallways and in the basement and so forth. And actually, before we started, they showed a picture of somebody with a big scratch on their arm and said, this is when somebody went down there and asked the ghost how it died. So
Okay.
be careful what you say when you're down there.
So
Then they had us using all kinds of thermal sensor equipment and EVP cameras and whatever all the equipment is that they use.
they sent you out with it.
Yeah,
so,
they let us actually use it for some of the time.
So you had it in the basement?
I had it in the basement.
How'd that go?
It was interesting. First, they open up an application on a computer that apparently is picking up what the spirits are saying, and it was just an internet site. So yeah, there was just some random things on there. Nothing that seemed like much. They also had us download an app, and I'm going to throw this out there for everybody, and I know you may find this hard to believe already. I am a skeptic, as they called me.
I know. I was going to
they had us
say he's a
download
resident skeptic here.
Had us download a specific app on our phones. They told us exactly which ones to get, and we got them, and it was bringing up words apparently spirits were saying. And in the basement, I'd ask some questions. I didn't really get much in the way of answers, of course.
What'd you ask?
What's my name? Where are you from? Things like that.
Right.
If there's something down here, show me, do something, move something, kind of things.
Yeah.
There was
So
nothing.
you were doing the thing that you'll see where people will go out and kind of try to provoke it into some sort of activity.
I was behaving. I mean, I don't want to be
you?
disrespectful to the people that were there. So they had me ask questions and do some things, but it got better as it went on.
So nothing? Nothing at all?
Nothing that made me think anything. The basement was creepy. I'll give them that.
Yeah.
It was creepy. Completely unfinished, just dirt and concrete and dark.
Right.
It was creepy. Then they took us out in the field. Asked me again if I believed anything yet. Said no. So they put me out behind where these flashlights were.
They put me out there. So they put me out in the field.
So then
now
they
at this
tried to
point.
tell the ghosts to, show me their presence, to try and tug my sweatshirt or do something to show they exist. And I stood there for a while, and I made sure to turn around to make sure nobody was sneaking up behind me to tug me. And
Yeah.
there was nothing. And then they put a couple other people over there, and one of them said that she felt her hand being held. Another one said she felt something, and there was one said again she smelt and tasted blood.
Ugh.
Whatever.
Ugh.
I got nothing.
Ugh. Are you one of those people that has sensitivity to pick up the mood in a room? like I'm one of those people who I can't read the room in front of me or the people's faces in front of me. So if it were a ghost, I definitely can't pick up on it because I just don't have the sensitivity for that.
No, I'm not somebody that picks up on things like that. I mean, I will say again, my wife does believe in it. She believed
does,
that
yeah.
she lived in a place that was haunted once.
Did she have any experiences?
Oh, while we were there, yeah, she actually said she felt her finger being held at one point. In a previous story in an old farmhouse she lived in before I was with her, she said they had experiences where they'd hear walking in the hallways at night, lights like every night at like 2:30 in the morning would just turn on in some cases. And there was one instance where I guess their grandfather's cane was hanging on the wall while he was visiting, and it turned.
So your wife's a believer.
Well, she's a believer. I'm a believer in science, I said. So basically, you have problems with electric surges, a house settling, and trucks driving by. But, people believe what they want to believe.
What about you guys? What about you, Andy and Ken?
I don't completely dismiss it. I think that there can be, resonating energy, I think, that you can pick up on. Maybe if you're more of like an empath.
Right, like somebody who's
so
more, got a little more sensitive. I know Ken's grinning, so I know Ken's answer.
Oh, I can't wait to hear this.
I'm in the Marshall camp. I'm a complete skeptic. I'm sorry.
And, I got to say, I'm kind of undecided. With what I understand of the light spectrum, what we can see of the light spectrum is minuscule,
a small portion, yes,
compared to the entire electromagnetic spectrum.
Same thing with sound waves.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, well, I guess there's a possibility that maybe we just haven't come up with the equipment to actually detect anything yet, because that's kind of how before Galileo was like, oh, the Earth's flat because that's all we can see.
Here's my take on it. If it was real, somebody would have documented something over the course of the last hundreds of years that actually proves it.
Yeah, you think so? Because that's what I'm saying. Do you think maybe we
There'd
just
be
can't
something
detect
proof.
it yet?
Listen, with all the paranormal hunting that's out there, somebody would have gotten a video of a ghost walking around or of a true activity that you couldn't explain.
Right. Well, there are those. Those are floating around, but it's just whether or not you believe they're real, photos, or if they're fake photos. And
Photoshop is a beautiful thing.
No. It's just
listen. Yeah. So I'll, after I finish the story, I'll tell you about some paranormal stuff afterwards.
Okay, so more. Tell me the rest of the story.
So finish it off. So we stopped at the third stop. More of the same. Not a whole lot going on there. So when it was all over, they asked me if I saw the light at all yet, or if I'm still completely skeptic, and I said I see nothing that changes my opinion at all. They're like, well, why don't you go down in the basement? I'm like, you're gonna go down in there alone? They're like, sure, okay, no problem. So I go down there, and Candy comes with me, my wife, and we close the door, and so I'm like, all right, listen, if there is anything in the way of a spirit in this basement, scratch me, kick me, push me, pull me, do something to show me you exist.
Yeah.
Nothing.
And
I sat there for a while. We turned the lights off, the whole thing, nothing.
Right.
So we come back out, and this is my favorite part of the story. They asked if anything happened, and I said no, and everybody agreed that's because I intimidated them.
I was going to say,
I intimidated the ghost.
Yeah, I was going to say, they're never going to show up where you're at.
Those of you that are friends with me on social media saw some of my posts. That I'm in the wrong career. I am going to become a Ghostbuster. I actually, one of my artists was kind enough to do a mock-up of me as a Ghostbuster.
Nice.
Yeah.
Which is now online and fairly available. And
fairly available if you'd like to have it.
I made sure for Halloween I got a Ghostbusters costume.
Oh, did you? Okay.
I did.
All right, so you got one of those.
Hey, there's money to be made.
Marshall ain't afraid no.
I'm entrepreneurial.
I want to bring it back to weather for a second. What was the weather like that night when you guys were there?
It was a very chilly night, and the weather just tie in as far as, one of the ways that is said to detect ghosts is by temperature. So they had thermal sensors and various types of thermometer, one that shot a beam and took a temperature of a surface. So they had me playing with that and, trying to get it to reach certain cold spots. And yeah, it was a clear, very chilly night in Gettysburg, so I found some cold spots because the ground radiates when it's
right.
And by the way, it was from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m.
Right.
So it's middle of the night.
Perfect
the ground
timing.
is radiating. Yeah, I found some nice cold spots, and all of them perfectly expected.
Well,
nothing that I couldn't explain.
Yeah.
Well, because we were talking with JV just a little while ago, and he was talking about, sometimes when there's heat waves, or really pointed to rain. Obviously, a ton of meteorologists over the years. Has anyone that you've worked with or talked to ever had an experience during a rainstorm with a ghost?
No.
That's simple.
That's simple. No.
So I'll give you this. And this is interesting, and I can't necessarily explain this completely, though I know the reasoning, ultimately. We drove around the battlefields in Gettysburg, and several of my pictures had this aqua blue, tiny little spot on them near the bottom of the pictures. Different pictures, different places had this same little color mark. Not all of them, just some. Now, I was told that is an orb, and again, a sign of something paranormal.
Yeah.
Or a light anomaly.
Right, an occurrence of light hitting the lens in a certain way. But people will take that as they may. I thought that was interesting that it's the same color and the same type and the different parts of the bottom of pictures. People can make of it what they may. As I said, I tend to believe that's just how light happened to be hitting the lens at those particular times.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty interesting. Like I said, I still think there's a possibility we just don't have what it takes to detect that there's other kinds of energy. But I don't know. I don't know if I believe it, don't believe it. I am not a skeptic, but I don't necessarily believe that it's...
And I've gone on one of those before as well. I've gone on, a ghost hunt. There was a little bit of stuff. We set up like some motion cameras and like those trigger objects, like a doll or something like that. Mm-hmm. It was at an old tavern in and around the area. Down in the bar at about like 2:30 in the morning, very uneasy feeling. Like I just felt like something was watching.
How many
me.
drinks did you have?
That's
at that point?
to go there.
None.
Yeah, at a bar, people seeing things. What a shock!
Very uneasy feeling. I felt like I was kind of being watched, and we used one of those spirit boxes where it goes through radio waves and it can pick up spirit voices, kind of like an EVP. And
I think that's kind of what the app was that I was talking about.
Yeah, sort of. We kind of like asked like a question and didn't hear much, but then I got like one answer and it was kind of it was like an oddly specific type answer. I asked a question, I forget what it was about. It was a couple years ago, and the answer that I got was kind of close to what I asked, the sound that I got. So I felt a lot of cold. I heard some things, but nothing like really, really super, oh my God, I'm absolutely terrified, but like an unnerved feeling.
Yeah.
Kind of an uneasy feeling.
Right. Like, okay, so my family, now this isn't my ghost story, because like I said, I have no sensitivity, so I don't pick up on anything. But neither does my brother Rocco. He has absolutely no sensitivity. So when he was a kid, we had this 200-year-old barn, and it was one of those ones that's so old it was put together with the wooden pegs, and they didn't even have like the metal stakes. And so he hated when he would be up there by himself, because he said one time he was up there and he saw somebody on like a rafter and smelled pipe smoke. And then another time he said he walked in and he heard someone say from that general vicinity, "Oh, there you are." And he like freaked out. And so he hated that barn. He eventually tore down the barn and he was more than happy to do that when he built a new barn. But like he swears, and he is like totally so I'm kind of like, well, I don't know, there might just be the possibility. I still don't know. I think I would want it to be like scientific stuff made by scientists or physicists or somebody, then I might trust that a little bit more. But so I'm like you, Andy. I'm not sure how I feel about it. But I've never personally had any experiences at all, and doubt that I ever would. So, but thanks so much. Marshall ain't afraid of no ghosts. He just ain't.
Marshall is sure.
What's that? Yeah,
Marshall is sure.
Marshall is sure. So we'll see. There might be something one day. You never know. But thanks for sitting down with me, Marshall.
Thank
I appreciate
you.
it. It was fun. And now here's Elliot Abrams with This Week in Weather.
There's the normal and there's the paranormal. 6 years ago this week, a storm that wasn't normal hit the eastern United States. Its name was Sandy. The storm had started off the Florida coast and headed northward, and typically a storm that comes up to the middle Atlantic coast will simply go out to sea at that point. This one didn't. It came up to just along the New Jersey coast and headed westward. Many of the computer models had suggested that would occur, but until it actually did, it was hard to believe it would. Winds gusted along the Jersey coast and into Long Island at better than 75 miles per hour, or worse than 75. Tremendous damage, some of which hasn't been repaired even now. An almost unprecedented storm. Was it ghostly? Was it really paranormal? Well, storms like that in the past have occurred sometimes, but not that frequently. What about this week? Well, we don't have any storm like that. Of course, if forecasts change, we'll revamp our forecast. And we think that there won't be any thunderstorms the next few days, so the monster that flies a kite in a thunderstorm, Frankenstein, will be out of business. But the weather through the end of the week, basically dry, and then the storm will affect the northeast part of the country this weekend, with rain that could end as wet snow, especially across the interior. I'm AccuWeather meteorologist Elliot Abrams.
Thanks, Elliot. Well, our intern, Caroline DiCarlo, is sitting here with me. She's from New York, and you were just saying that Sandy impacted your trick-or-treating that year.
It did. I was in 8th grade at the time, and I was still trick-or-treating as an 8th grader, and which was the bigger problem.
You were one of the kids I turn away at the door, and I'm like, no, come on, you're too old. No, I'm just teasing.
No, I might have been. But anyway, so Sandy touched down on October 29th that year, and our mayor made a phone call on the 29th, just letting everyone know that he was officially moving Halloween to, it was either November 1st or 2nd or something like that. And so everyone just stayed inside on the 31st and instead went out, I guess it was that weekend.
Yeah. So what were you, out of curiosity?
Me and my friends were a deck of cards that year. So
really?
I was probably like the Queen of Hearts or something funny like that. I don't know. But we were a deck of cards.
Yeah, so you were definitely impacted by it. And you know what? Folks are be heading out for Halloween this year. And we just want to let you know that you can download our AccuWeather app because, talking about inclement weather, it has the minute-by-minute forecast for your area. So you can kind of look at it. It says rain in 5 minutes, so you know whether or not you need to get into somebody's house and start getting some treats.
Absolutely. Stay safe and on top of all those current conditions with MinuteCast on the AccuWeather app.
Right. And next week, Caroline just happened to hook us up with next week's interview, which we're pretty excited about. We are going to be talking about politics, elections, and how the weather affects the turnout and the ultimate outcome of some of these elections. So we're excited about that. Tune in.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the AccuWeather Podcast, giving you the stories behind the weather, discussions on trending weather topics, and so much more. New episodes every Thursday. Just search for AccuWeather on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite shows.